The like sheer volume of pornography in this is quite impressive. Hello and welcome back to my channel. Oh hi, if you're new, my name is Emma, Complet grad, film student, and I'm really impressed that I've had the time to read these books, make this video, and upload it so that you're watching it. Well done me. So when I kind of went back through my Goodreads to sort of tot up like, oh, when was the last time I did a, you know, what I read video, and I realised was my like everything I read in lockdown video. And I was like, I probably haven't read that much since then. And I shorted it up and I was like, well, I read a bunch of books. What a shock. I read so much more now than I did during my undergrad, and it doesn't make any sense. I don't even do a literature degree. Why do I read somehow more now? This is everything I've read pretty much since the end of lockdown till now. I'm filming this in July, so this is what I've read in summer so far. Some of these I will have talked about in my vlogs. If you want to catch up on those, playlist is up there for you. If you're new and you're like, oh, I don't want to watch the vlogs, the book content is deeply embedded in the vlogs. Initially, that's where all of the book content was, until I was like, oh, you want those as separate videos? So even old videos have book content. I'm just going to start off with something that I'm currently reading. I haven't finished it yet, but I'm absolutely obsessed. This is Virginia Woolf's Orlando. This is currently getting quite beat up. I'm bringing it in my bag absolutely everywhere. I'm reading most of this on the tube and on trains and stuff when I'm like running around London trying to do errands, and I'm like, oh, I have to go to this random, I have to go to a random props house in North, like really far North London. I'll take my book because it's an hour on the tube. So I'm like, commuting is a wonderful thing sometimes, because it's like, oh, well, I have to have this time anyway, I may as well be productive. And also I forgot a notebook for a class I went to, so I wrote it in the back of this book. The whole annotating thing is just a really useful life skill to have. If you would like to improve that life skill, I have a really this is one of my most popular videos explaining how I process it. Anyway, speaking of processing things, I love Orlando. This is a fantastic book. I haven't finished it yet, but about 50 pages left. I have avoided Virginia Woolf for quite a long time. My friends had to study her at school and lots of them really hated it, so I was like, I don't really want to read that. But I started reading this, and it's also because Orlando is one of the ones that I hadn't really heard about. I watched Sally Porter's adaptation of Orlando, which is a great film, by the way, and then I just didn't realise it was a book. We learn, we grow, we accumulate information and knowledge. That was my wrist that just clicked. Written for Virginia Woolf's intimate friend, the charismatic bisexual writer Vita Sackville-West, Orlando is a playful mock biography of a chameleon-like historical figure who changes sex and identity at will. First masculine, then feminine, Orlando begins life as a young 16th century nobleman, then gallops through the centuries to end up as a woman writer in Virginia Woolf's own time. This is honestly brilliant. I feel like because Woolf is so revered in terms of like how good she is and stuff, that sometimes that puts people on such a pedestal, but it's deeply off-putting. I mean, that's been my agenda to help like other people understand like classics and stuff, classics and classic literature, because it's really not. And then I can't believe that like that's my whole point, and I still fell victim to it with Virginia Woolf. I've read A Room of One's Own. I really like that, really rate it. And Orlando is just it's so good. Like her, how do I describe her writing? It's like, God, let me channel my inner Orlando here. It's so akin to like just, I just want to describe it as butter. That's kind of what it feels like to read it, is when you have some like slightly melted butter that like you've just been like staring at dinner, and then like the bread and stuff arrives, and then that's what you get to like scoop through, and you're like, It's kind of, that's the aura, you're like, this is really hitting the spot right now. And kind of especially of need and desire. Like she just doesn't care. You can see why this has been incorporated so much in like gender studies and stuff, because it's so matter of fact, and Orlando is not explained. Hello?
Hello.
And breathe quietly. Orlando is the kind of thing where you get so much caught up in it, and it's very unexplained, especially if you look at her like approach to time. For so often I just cannot figure out how long, like, is she serious or is she joking about how long time has passed? Sometimes she says like, oh, Orlando goes out for a walk sometimes it's 3 weeks, sometimes it's 50 years, and you're like, well, is this a joke, or is she like genuine about this? So in terms of her like approach to time, you don't know what's going on, and that's kind of the point of this, is like, in a way that Watermelon Sugar and like Brotigan doesn't fucking hell! Are you okay? Not the ironing board desk. Like Brotigan and Watermelon Sugar, there are parameters that are like set up in terms of how this works. In Watermelon Sugar, he sort of just tells you about the rules. He doesn't like explain the rules, it just sort of is, and that's kind of how it feels reading this. Orlando is never explained. We don't know really why, we don't know what for, there's no explanation, which is basically what my main complaint about the film adaptation was, but reading this now it just makes sense. This is just what this world is like. The point is, everything in Orlando is very matter of fact, but that aside, Woolf's writing is so fun. It is so fun. It's similar to Calvino in that sense. It's so fun, it's so playful, and again, it's one of the greats, it's one of the classics that often we're forced to read and then we just don't want to do it. You get so often butchered by teachers who are underpaid, don't care enough, blah blah blah, who just sometimes just not good. So I really feel for you if you've ever had just a bad English teacher who's ruined a book for you, especially when you still have to like, you have to do it, not when you're doing like your A-levels, but like when you're doing GCSEs, and we all just have to get through it. But I think Orlando as a book deserves more love, and I feel like it deserves to be one of Woolf's more famous ones than it actually is, because I don't know why it took me so long to discover it, but I've almost finished it, and it's brilliant. It's so brilliant, and I cannot recommend it enough. Next, and this is ages ago, so I can't remember if I told you about it or not, so I'm going to do this quickly. I read Sun Tzu, The Art of War. I've read a couple other things like Machiavelli, The Prince and stuff, because we love just explanations on power. Offering ancient wisdom on how to use skill, cunning, tactics and discipline to outwit your opponent, this best-selling 2,000-year-old military manual is still worshipped by soldiers on the battlefield and managers in the boardroom as the ultimate guide to winning. It's poetry. The idea of it's meant to be like balanced and measured, and you're never meant to be overly emotional when you're making a decision, but we're naturally emotional beings, so you can never really do that, but that's not the point. Read it quite quickly. It's worth reading, and I can't remember very much more about it other than, yeah, just common sense. But then again, so many people are lacking in common sense like you would not believe. So if you worry that you're one of those people, yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say on that. I also don't have much cultural context and framework within which to comment on it. So if those of you who do have that, let me know down below what your thoughts on this were. I can't remember if I spoke about this one. I'm doing so well. I can't remember if I spoke about this either. This was Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. This had been on my to read list in terms of like filling in like gaps of my knowledge for like a very long time. It came so highly recommended on my complete course just because one of the first like African novels. Okonkwo is the greatest wrestler and warrior alive, and his fame spreads throughout West Africa like a bushfire in the Harmattan. But when he accidentally kills a clansman, things begin to fall apart. Then Okonkwo returns from exile to find missionaries and the colonial governors have arrived in the village. With his world thrown radically off balance, he can only hurtle towards tragedy. This again was absolutely brilliant, and it is one of the best things I have read in a long time. Not just in terms of content, but just style. Because I've read some, I guess, easier things that sometimes, and I think this applies to Calvino, I think it applies to Woolf. If you're reading easier things and some things just for like fun and like to relax and stuff, there's nothing wrong with that. That's completely fine and that's great. But sometimes you then just miss out on people who have this incredible mastery of language, and you just like, this is one of those people. Virginia Woolf is one of those people, Calvino is one of those people, and their stuff is just glorious to read. You read it and you're like, this is, you just know. Because I think some people, they may have great stories, but they just don't necessarily know what to do with it. Achebe is absolutely one of those people. I ended up buying the next, because this is a trilogy, so I ended up buying the next two in the trilogy, which are Arrow of God and No Longer At Ease. But I'm pretty sure I spoke about this in a different video. I'll link it below if I remember, or it's there if I remember which one. But this was something that I have read, and I think it was really, really good. If you haven't read any African literature, this is specifically Nigerian, but if you haven't read any, this is a good place to start, or at least this is where a lot of institutions who are teaching post-colonial studies in the West, teaching literature, will start from. This is that reference point. But if you have different ones that you think are good, obviously put in comments. All ears, always am. Next, I made an entire video on this. I read The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I won't talk about this at length because you have an entire video there for you. Reclusive Hollywood icon Evelyn Hugo is finally ready to tell the truth about her glamorous and scandalous life, but when she chooses unknown magazine reporter Monique Grant to write her story, no one is more astounded than Monique herself. From making her way to Los Angeles in the 1950s, to leaving show business in the 1980s, and of course with 7 husbands along the way, Evelyn unspools a tale of ruthless ambition, unexpected friendship, and a great forbidden love. But as Evelyn's story nears its conclusion, it becomes quite clear that her life intersects with Monique's own in tragic and irreversible ways. I discussed this in my video. I don't think this blurb is very good at all. It just gives so much away. Like, for what though? Like, who thought this was okay? Anyway, this is a good example of something that like I read just purely just for fun and because you guys really recommended it. Her writing is truthfully, her writing is okay. It's fine. There's nothing horribly the bits written from Monique's point of view are not great, and they were like you had to like get through those to get to the good stuff. Her story is fun. Her story is fun. Her story is great. I like her characters. The writing is so-so. This is the kind of thing where the writing is every single word you read, you just want to read it like a million times because you're just like, this is fucking glorious. It's fine. But I think that to an extent is what separates, you know, the good from the great. Good story, fun story, enjoyed it. But it's not this. It's not this. And you just need people who can do it all. Some people can get away with doing like a decent amount, good characters, good plot, whatever. Some people have good plot and good writing, some people have good characters, but it's not this. And also this has stood the test of time and sort of, even if you have like new generations of readers reading it, enjoying it, they still get something from it. This hasn't, you know, this just hasn't stood the test of time yet. We will see. But I enjoyed it. Obviously, again, this is more queer. This is based on... I'm not going to be specific in case you guys haven't read it, but I kind of feel like this lends itself better to being a limited series or a film. Probably a limited series rather than being a book. Sometimes that's just how it feels, like especially if it's very character driven. It was probably better off being a TV series, which I think they're making it into. Actually, I think HBO are doing something, but I would watch it. It was good, it was fun. That's pretty much what I have to say on that. If you want the rest, it's obviously in the cards or it's linked below. I liked it, and it was moving, but the writing was so-so. The characters are excellent though. That's my thoughts on that. The thing I then read after this, I finally read Fanny Hill. There is so much porn in this. I'm hard to shock. I've read Sard for God's sakes, but this, I was just, the like sheer volume of pornography in this is quite impressive. Structurally with Sard, with Marquise de Sade, it's like you'll have 2 pages of porn and then maybe a digression of 10 pages of philosophy. And that's sort of the rhythm you get into. That's the rhythm in pretty much every one of his novels that I've read. And like, I'm used to that. I'm like, okay, you have a lot of intense stuff and then you have other intense stuff, but it's very much divorced from one another. This is just porn. If we're saying how it's philosophy, and I'm like, this isn't philosophy. I was expecting it to be philosophy to the degree that Sard is philosophy. This is just porn. This is just a lot of erotica. It's porn. Considering the amount of fan fiction as well that I have read, this was very funny compared to that. This only uses metaphors and euphemisms. There's nowhere in this that it actually will say just like penis or vagina. It doesn't do it. So everything has a metaphor and it's really, really, really funny. This book has no business being as funny as it is. I can say that adamantly, outright. This has no business being as funny as it is. Especially if you're reading it and you're a little bit tired, you're a little bit like, I've somehow been reading porn for the last 10 pages. This is just very, very funny. It's a very interesting take on the 18th century. It's a lot of that stuff that people don't want you to know. Dermatologists hate her. Seedy London underbelly sort of stuff. And it's especially interesting in terms of looking at like women and their approach to sex and like not forgetting that there have always been women who really like sex and all of that. Like it's nothing new. Kind of more of a sexual liberation just like hit the mainstream. People felt like they were allowed to talk about it. A historical approach to sex is always interesting, and I remind that you've never done anything original in bed. At all. How else are you here? Really interesting for that perspective if that's something that you're interested in, but this is just not something I'm gonna recommend to everyone. That is my same stance on Sard. It's, if you're going ever down like gender studies, sex, women's rights, absolutely read this. But if you're just a casual consumer of literature, I think you can skip this one, but I'm glad I've read it because I've read about it quite a few times, especially with what my disso is about, women, sex and power and stuff. So, and that's also like the triad of things I like making films about. It's also funny how much like gay stuff there is in this as well. It's not approached in the same way that like contemporary like homosexuality is, and especially in the way that female homosexuality is just like, it's just not acknowledged as anything like bad ever, which is always just so interesting. And then like how like male homosexuality is so criminalized and so like but even in this, that approach isn't taken. I feel like for Cleland, like, sex is sex. There are people you can read historically that are more liberal than some of our views now, which is always just like fascinating to me because we always like to think that we're the most like liberal and most progressed right now than we've ever been, which is just not true, and sex is no exception to that. For Cleland, sex is sex. And yeah, because also like lesbianism has never been criminalized in this country. It's always been fine. But the most important thing almost in this in terms of message is like, it's her desire for sex. It's Fanny's desire for it's Fanny's desire for sex. It's Fanny's agency, and like very often initially she's coerced, but then she does take more agency and action, and she has more control over her situation, her sex and her body. And also there's an adventurous element to it. Some things are suggested to her. She tries them out of curiosity, and then she decides, not for me. I just think that's a great approach. So if you have any interest in English literature, 18th century, anything about women, sex, power, this is an interesting one to read, but not for everyone. Like I said, that's my stance on Sard, that's gonna be my stance on this too. It took me a while to read because it's just so much porn. You can't just sit down and read that much porn in one sitting. Like, you can't. It was like maybe half a page between some of the scenes, and it was like, and again, actually similarly, not quite similarly to Orlando, but passage of time in this is quite interesting because maybe there'll be like maybe 10 pages but a span about half an hour, and then another half page which is maybe like a couple of years. You're like, it kind of feels like you're in the car with someone who doesn't know how to use the clutch properly, which is interesting because Orlando is very fluid in its time. It's very like, you're just kind of like, oh, it feels like you're in a car and you miss an exit and you're like, wait, when did that happen? But this is like you're in a car and someone's going, this is me if I drive you around in the car. Forced by the death of her parents to seek her fortune in London, Fanny Hill is duped into prostitution by an aged procuress. In Mrs. Brown's bawdy house, the naive young woman begins her sexual initiation, progressing from innocence to curiosity and desire, and soon embarks on her own path in pursuit of pleasure, until she at last finds true love. John Cleland's story of Fanny's rise to respectability was denounced after its publication by the Bishop of London as an open insult upon religion and good manners, while James Boswell called it a most litigious and inflaming book. But besides its highly entertaining and boisterous depictions of startling variety of sexual acts, Fanny Hill stands as one of the great works of 18th century fiction for its unique combination of parody, eroticism, and philosophy of sensuality. That's the other thing about this, is it's an anti-Pamela. So many of these books are anti-Pamela, especially the ones that talk about sex, because the whole idea in Pamela is like she like resists the advances of her master, and therefore he respects her, and because she didn't like give away any of her sexuality in any way, that now she's allowed to marry and rise through the ranks. But that's bullshit. It's a really weird kind of twisted perverse fairy tale for that. Like, no, just because you like, you know, don't shag your master doesn't mean that you will become a duchess. And a lot of these books take the piss out of that. Pamela was so influential because it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. They were like, what? I've never read all of it because it's just so A, long, and B, you're being preached at for about 500 pages about why you shouldn't, as a woman, you know, have sex with people. So yeah, no, there are so many anti-Pamelas, and this is a really quite a famous one, so that's also, if you're ever reading Pamela, you want to talk about this too, because Fanny goes around and has a lot of sex and she still rises to respectability and love and marriage, because it's not mutually exclusive. And also this is just like a general reminder, because so many people still get taken in by like purity culture and like myths and like innocence and stuff like that, and it's just really fucked up. So yeah, virginity is a myth. Anyway, and then next I went to my comfort place. I read Nancy Mitford, Love in a Cold Climate, and I read Nancy Mitford, Don't Tell Alfred. These are still like the same sort of society, like the same world as Pursuit of Love is, and I loved Pursuit of Love a lot. I read I've bought almost pretty much all of Nancy Mitford's books. I read this, I think I read this back in March, because I'd read so much during lockdown. I'd read a lot of like good stuff. I'll put my video there for that one. But I'd read so much good stuff and so much like more intellectual stuff. I was definitely still trying to read Judith Butler at the time. I have sacked that off now because it is so hard, it gave me a headache. I will try that again, but no time soon, so I needed something easy. And I feel like, I've said this before, Mitford very often, she feels like poolside reading that is just maybe that little bit more elevated. You're gonna lose just a few less brain cells reading this, at least in my opinion, and I'm kind of willing to sacrifice them for this. Like it is a decent trade-off in my mind. Love in a Cold Climate is, again, it's written from, is her name also Fanny? Her name is also Fanny. But again, it's from Fanny's perspective. She's a little bit older. Pursuit of Love is like from like their childhood to like their sort of teens and early 20s. This is a little bit older than that. But again, it's about Fanny's perspective on someone else and her like interactions with them, how she knows them, how she sees them and their life. And she very like gently dips in and out of like her life meeting Alfred and all of that kind of stuff, having their kids. Her life is very unacknowledged, but this is all about somebody called Polly Hampton and, you know, a wealthy heiress. She's the only heiress to her parents' fortune. The fact that she goes off with somebody very inappropriate for her, and all the like, what, farce, I suppose, that ensues from that. But again, you're sort of a world that's just like interwar, high society set, you know, going to these beautiful castles, these buildings, these like, you're living in sort of, it is about elitism obviously, and it's an indulgence of elitism that Nancy Mitford was used to, and she doesn't moralise it. She just enjoys it, I guess, because that is her world. She's a little bit more in tune than I think other people are, but I still, or like other portrayals of elitism and wealth that I've experienced, like, this is a bit more in tune. But yeah, she sort of reads again like Evan and War, like they were very good friends, and it's just kind of funny watching other people fuck up their lives, because you remember that it's like, this is nothing new. Like, you fucking up your love life isn't anything new. It's always a shock when you're like, oh yeah, they get married after knowing each other like a month, and you're like, I've had more serious relationships with a pen. Like, what? No, absolutely not. And so how times have changed and stuff, but yeah. I also think that, and this is actually something Woolf says in Orlando, that like poets and authors and novelists probably will write a more accurate description of society at the time than anybody who's trying to be a biographer or like historian, just because they don't need the truth, and because they don't need the truth, they're probably getting somewhere more accurate than people who are trying to get it dead right are. Do you know what I mean? It's just really fun, it's really funny, and that's just what Mitford is, and at least what Mitford is to me. Ah, the dresses, but oh the monotony of the season, with its endless run of glittering balls. Even fabulously fashionable Polly Hampton, with her startling good looks and excellent social connections, is beginning to wilt under the glare. Groomed for the perfect marriage by her mother, fearsome Lady Montdor, Polly instead scandalises society by declaring her love for her uncle, Boy Dugdale, the lecherous lecturer, and promptly marrying him. But the consequences of this union no one could quite expect. And also, Mitford's books really often have sad endings. This is one of her like themes. Her books are all fun, but then they really have some quite sad endings, and you're like, oh, what? But I guess also with her doing the biographies that she's done and stuff, like, yeah, biographies are always the one where they die at the end, right? Anyway, moving on. This was fun. They kind of go down, so like Pursuit of Love is the best one, then Love in a Cold Climate is a good second best. This is a little bit further down in terms of like quality, but I think Don't Tell Alfred, I have a soft spot for it because I've read so much of Mitford's writing that like, I just know her style really well, and again, you're returning to familiar characters, familiar places, a familiar style, familiar themes, so you kind of feel like hello.
Alright.
Nancy Mitford feels a lot like you're going somewhere. It's somewhere that you've gone on holiday quite a few times and you're just happy to be there again. That's kind of what reading Mitford is like. Don't Tell Alfred is set a couple of decades, it's set quite a while later than the other books, and this is the first one that is actually about Fanny's life. So you really see things about her from her. You get more of a sense about her in this. Fanny's an unreliable narrator through and through, so that's why seeing it about her own life is just like a little bit funnier. But again, I enjoyed this. It's like set later, so you sort of get an update as to what happened with everyone, and you'll get updates from Pursuit of Love and Love in a Cold Climate, like how those storylines pretty much have played out in this, especially like spoilers, at the end of Pursuit of Love when Linda dies, that baby, Fanny takes that baby, Fanny looks after that baby, so that baby has now become like a 14-15-year-old boy. But then how like that's progressed and all of like sort of tying up a lot of details, because this is the last one that Fanny is in, so it's sort of like the last one from this world, so it ties up a lot of the like questions that people might have had from earlier books. In terms of writing, it's not better than the others, but I found it worth reading because I'd already got so used to the story, and I'm like, I just want to go back in that cocoon. Fanny is married to absent-minded Don Alfred and content with her role as a plain Tweedy housewife, but overnight her life changes when Alfred is appointed English ambassador in Paris. In the blink of an eye, Fanny's mixing with royalty, Rothschilds and Dior-clad wives, throwing cocktail parties and having every indiscreet remark printed in tomorrow's papers. But with the love lives of her new friends to organise, an aristocratic squatter who won't budge, and the antics of her maverick sons to thwart, Fanny's far too busy to worry about the diplomatic crisis looming on the horizon. I think the diplomatic crisis in this is kind of dumb, but I guess it couldn't really be anything that serious. And it's just occurred to me that The Blessing is actually, there are characters from that book in this book, but this is set later. So timeline-wise, it's Pursuit of Love, Love in a Cold Climate, The Blessing, then it's Don't Tell Alfred. It's nice reading like Paris from Mitford's perspective, because you know, she spent a lot of her life there, she knows it very well. And I know you do get that in Pursuit of Love, but I think you get it better in this. So yeah, I come for Reid. I'm pretty sure I was ill when I read this as well, so I read half of it in one sitting because I was just like, I don't feel very well. And that's coming from your resident dyslexic booktuber. So I read half of this in a sitting, yeah, you can probably read all of it in one go. And they're thoroughly enjoyable. And also because her style isn't crap. That's my gripe with so many, like a lot of more modern things that haven't stood the test of time yet. Their style just isn't very good. Mitford's style is great, and that's one of the reasons that I bought so many of her books. Like I said, I think I pretty much bought all of them. Basically for me, she's quite reliable in terms of like style content. I know what I'm gonna get, and I really don't mind getting it again and again and again. It does feel like you're reading the same book a couple times, but I don't like rereading books, so it's kind of same but different, and I'm okay with that. Can you type less aggressively, please? Your mum genuinely types like that. Oh no, I forgot a book. I forgot a book. And lastly, very lastly, Calvino's Distance to the Moon. This is a short story collection. This has, let me tell you what's in here. The Distance of the Moon, without colours, as long as the sun lasts, and Implosion. It's sort of a series of cosmological short stories. These exuberant, endlessly innovative stories interweave scientific fact with wordplay, whimsy and cosmic flights of fancy in a strange and wondrous universe. These were really, really fun. It's just a lot of weird stuff in space. If you've read Calvino, everything he does is very playful. It's very just free, I guess, because he does a lot of folklore stuff. He does a lot of like what feels like kid stuff. This feels to an extent like kid stuff. The title story of Distance to the Moon is sort of a folklore tale of when people could still go on the moon, could still put their ladders against the moon, walk up and somersault onto the moon as they like came into contact with the moon's sort of gravitational pull. And it's like, I guess technically it's sci-fi, but I'm not particularly partial to sci-fi, and I really enjoyed this. It's a lot about how like our minds are so tiny that we can't perceive infinity, so we can't perceive that like enormousness of space, enormousness of time, and that's the main thing that Calvino plays with in this is that like, I was gonna say foreverness, infinity. This was also about £1, and it took me a day to read it. Well, not like a whole day, I just when I could. It's a tiny, tiny book of 60 pages. A lot of these short stories you can actually find online as PDFs, so I highly recommend. They're just fun, and they're just in a lot of ways a good snapshot of what Calvino is and what he's like if you've never read any of his stuff. I still think If on a Winter's Night a Traveller is better. In my book haul I talked about the new one that I bought, which I don't know where it's gone, about the guy who lives in the trees. So all of his stuff is just a little bit more out there and special, but again, in a similar vein to Vortigern, he doesn't explain shit. That's just how it is, that's just how the world is. Same vein as Orlando. You just sort of roll with what you've got, and this rolls around space with what you've got, and about the beginning of everything and the length of time in the universe. And then I ended up watching loads of videos about black holes and stuff because I was like, now I want to talk about space. If you have at any point got down that hole of watching those videos explaining how black holes work, explaining if like wormholes are theoretically real and stuff, if you've ever done that, you'll probably enjoy this because he embeds a lot of that like fiction sort of on a framework of scientific fact as understood by the common person who is not an astrophysicist. There we are. So, that is everything I have read recently. Explain why this pile always looks so much more like just haggard compared to all my like, get my new books in, there's all this nice, neat, shiny pile, and then there's this, which is just like, I have a meeting in 2 minutes, so I need to wrap this up. So, this is everything I've read recently in the summer so far, because I'm not really getting a summer holiday, but that's beside the point. Let me know if you've read any of these, if you like any of these authors, if you have any book recommendations, please leave them down below or DM me, I'm always all ears. You have a little shelf on my Goodreads of subscribe recommendations, so go check out what you've recommended to me to recommend to you. Thank you very, very much for watching, like, subscribe, and all that jazz, and I will see you guys not very soon, but I'm doing my best. Goodbye.
I like the way that you said Son 2 was common sense. You know, he talks about like chariot racing and stuff, like, it's